All right. So for those that don't know me, I think most of you do, but I'm Jock McKenzie. I'm a coastal wetland ecologist with Earthwatch Australia and the founder of the Mangrove Watch program and um, creator of the Saltmarsh Saver program. Joined here today by Lucan Sinclair, who's the mastermind behind the Saltmarsh Dashboard, as well as Lucia Caldas, who's our program coordinator in Townsville, but also the coordinator of the Saltmarsh Saver program wherever it occurs around Australia. So just like to acknowledge that the work that we're presenting here today has been supported through the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and the Reef Trust Partnership, as well as through the Queensland Government engaging science grants with a whole range of supporters listed down the bottom of organisations, community organisations and groups and traditional owner groups who've been involved in supporting and helping to collect the data that we're presenting here today. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and First Nations people around Australia's coastal regions and acknowledge that Aboriginal people and Australia's First Nations people have continue the strong cultural and social and spiritual connections to saltmarsh habitats. And I recognise that First Nations people have cared for saltmarsh habitats for tens of thousands of years and generations. And I recognise and value that essential and continual contribution that these people play to mangrove and saltmarsh conservation around Australia. And I'm grateful to be working with many of them in that. For those who don't know Earthwatch, we're a global citizen science research organisation based in Melbourne. That's why I probably see I'm wearing a jumper today. But we work across Australia and through the Pacific as well. And Earthwatch is the host of the Mangrove Watch program, which started off in 2010. And that's a program that's all about getting people excited about mangroves and saltmarsh so we can better protect and manage these important habitats. So today we're talking about the Saltmarsh Saver Dashboard. This is basically your one-stop shop for community collected saltmarsh data. So it brings together monitoring data, community insights, and traditional owner knowledge to showcase local salt marshes, show why these salt marsh habitats matter, the threats they face, and which areas should be prioritised for protection and restoration. So the purpose of the dashboard is to give a space to identify and highlight community values of salt marsh habitats, as well as to document and understand the human and climate threats and pressures that these ecosystems face. Compare salt marsh condition and risk across regions and how they're changing over time, prioritize high value areas that are at risk that may need protection or investment for restoration, and provide a platform to support evidence-based salt marsh management and decision making. Just so we're, well, and I would like to thank all the wonderful people who have contributed to the Saltmarsh Saver program over the years. Through 2024 and 2025 alone, we had over 200 traditional owners, Indigenous rangers, and citizen scientists contribute over 500 observations of saltmarsh ecosystem values and threats from Bundaberg to Cairns. And so that's a massive community effort that's contributed to where we're at today and being able to display the data as we are. So just quickly, I'm going to give a really quick introduction to saltmarsh ecosystems, the Saltmarsh Savers methodology, and then Lucan will take you through the Saltmarsh Saver dashboard and we'll have some questions at the end. But during the webinar, if you want to just put any questions you have in the chat, we can address them either as we go or at the end as well. So Lucia will be monitoring the chat. All right, salt marsh. What is salt marsh? So salt marshes are an ecosystem that are part of the coastal wetland complex. They're tidal ecosystems. If you think of mangroves as being trees that live in the sea, salt marshes are the habitat that occurs often behind the mangroves, which comprised of plants that aren't trees. So all the little shrubs and rushes and reeds and grasses and herbs, as well as salt flats and algal mat that occur between mean sea level and the highest astronomical tide mark. So many of the plants that occur in salt marsh habitats can occur in saline habitats elsewhere. So you can see some familiar plants in inland Australia, but all these plants and animals that live in the salt marsh zone are adapted to saline tidal conditions and infrequent but regular tidal inundation. There's about 13,000 square kilometres of coastal salt marshes across Australia, with species diversity increasing as you move south. So areas like Victoria and Tasmania have very high salt marsh plant diversity, whereas there's lower plant diversity in the north. However, there is higher faunal diversity in the salt marshes in tropical Australia. So as you move south, you'll find different types of plants compared to the north. So there's different ones that are adapted to the dry tropical zones or wetter tropical areas as well, compared to the southern states. In Australia, subtropical and temperate salt marsh is officially protected as an endangered ecological community under the EPBC Act. Tropical salt marsh is not protected, not because it's not vulnerable, but because it's listed as having not enough data. So one of the reasons that we've set up the Salt Marsh Saver program, and with a focus on tropical Australia primarily, is to bridge that gap and fill in that data so that we can get tropical salt marsh with the same level of protection as its southern counterparts. And I should mention that for Queensland, where most people are joining from today, all marine plants are protected under the Fisheries Act, which includes salt marsh plants, but this does not necessarily provide the protection for ecosystem function and integrity of the habitat as a whole. So it just is a legislative lever to protect the plants. So I think for tropical salt marsh, there's a bit of a gap in their protection. These ecosystems are valuable. So just like mangroves and other coastal wetlands, they provide an array of different values which relate to seafood production and fisheries. So if you've eaten a fish or a crab or a prawn lately, then it's likely had some part of its life cycle linked to salt marsh habitats where they occur. So we know from estuaries in northern New South Wales, for example, that most of the carbon that makes up a bream originates from the productivity of the salt marsh ecosystems, and particularly the salt cooch, the Spirobolus virginicus grass, that occurs across many of our salt marsh regions throughout Australia. They provide shoreline protection, so act as a buffer between waves and storm surges for floods. They improve water quality, so help to filter water as it flows through on the tides and in flooding waters, so before it goes out into more sensitive subtidal ecosystems like coral reefs and seagrass that need clean water to survive. They're habitat for a huge array of wildlife, but of particular importance is their role as migratory bird habitat and high tide roost sites. So many salt marsh regions are listed as Ramsar wetlands because of that function, or they're designated as migratory bird flyways, such as in the Gulf of Carpentaria. They have cultural value, so they support shellfish, crabs, and other traditional food resources, as well as providing materials such as reeds, which are used for basket making and weaving. And they store huge amounts of carbon. So they're a blue carbon habitat. So that's the carbon that's stored in our marine systems, and salt marshes play a really important role in processing and storing carbon, taking it out of the atmosphere, trapping it into our coastal ecosystems where hopefully it can stay forever. And a lot of these values are linked to ecosystem structure and function. So the vegetation structure and the productivity and the little crabs and snails that feed on the algal mat and plants that are there, then the fish feed on them. So these features of the salt marsh link directly to their values. But it's also about the context of the salt marsh habitat itself. So where it sits within the estuary and the landscape, how it's connected to other habitats, as well as adjacent land uses, all those factors play a role in its value. So a salt marsh habitat that has a sewage treatment plant upstream and some stormwater running off into it actually probably has a higher value for water quality improvement than a very well protected, pristine salt marsh area away from human impacts. But these habitats are vulnerable. They're threatened by climate change. They exist in that narrow band between mean sea level and the highest astronomical tide mark. So we're seeing sea level rise that is shifting our coastal landscapes. And as that sea level rises, the salt marsh being at the back of the tidal habitats want to move landward. And often they cannot because we have houses and agriculture and roads and things in the way. And we call that coastal squeeze. So we're getting mangroves moving into the salt marsh, which we call mangrove encroachment, because the mangroves are shifting as the sea level is rising. The salt marsh wants to move back, but it has nowhere to go. And we're also seeing that on salt marsh areas around the place, as that sea level rises, there's more erosion and scouring of those salt marsh areas, which decreases the vegetation coverage on some of those sites. And salt marsh particularly is vulnerable to changing rainfall patterns because that, as if we get increasing rainfall, that allows more mangroves to move in. If we're getting decreasing rainfall, that dries out those areas and increases salinity on some of these habitats. So it changes the way those ecosystems function. And unfortunately, the fact that we know these habitats are valuable, we know they're vulnerable to sea level rise and climate change, we're still not very good at managing our coastal wetland habitats, including salt marsh. So you can see here, one of the biggest threats to salt marsh is vehicles. Most areas you go to where there's accessible salt marsh habitats, you'll find that someone's had some fun out there with their four-wheel drive or motorbike, and it looks like a nice open space, good place to play in the mud, but causes a lot of damage. And we still allow cattle grazing on these areas. There's feral pigs. We change the hydrology, dump our rubbish there, use them as sites to pump our stormwater into, as well as have poor development and planning processes that lead to development directly adjacent to salt marsh habitats, which links to that coastal squeeze issue. So that's why we came up with the Salt Marsh Saver method as a tool to highlight and raise the awareness of the values of these areas and the threats that they face from the perspective of the people who live in those regions and depend on those salt marshes locally. So the Salt Marsh Saver method is a tool to convert citizen science surveys into reliable scores that identify salt marsh values, threats, and management priorities. So Salt Marsh Saver stands for Salt Marsh Subjective Assessment of Values and Ecosystem Risks. That's a nice little acronym. But ultimately, what we want to do is we know that to protect these ecosystems from the issues that are threatening them, that are compounding the impacts of climate change, we need local stewardship and local community-led management. So this is a tool to capture how local people value these areas and what they see and what they know as to be the threats. So we collect that data through the Salt Marsh Saver methodology using the EpiCollect 5 app. So you can log on to the app and score a whole lot of different criteria of categorized observations based on the EPBC conservation advice for subtropical and temperate salt marsh. And we collate those into different groupings so that you see here there's fish habitat values, carbon values, water quality values, as well as different types of threats. So whether they're direct damage threats, pollution, changes to hydrology, and what we call our climate pressures. So things that relate to sea level rise, which can be observed on the salt marsh habitat. We recognize that some people don't have any knowledge of salt marsh habitats, and some people have a lot, and some people have very high local knowledge. So we also ask people to score their knowledge of salt marsh habitats and their knowledge of the local area, and then use that to help weight the scores once we've done our score processing. So you don't need to know anything about salt marsh to do the survey. We have guides and tools that help people make these assessments. And once you're out on the site, you walk around and you're just scoring what you see based on what's in front of you. So this is an example of the fish habitat accessibility. So how easily can fish access the salt marsh site? I'll now hand over to Lucan, who'll take you through what happens to the data from there.
Thanks, Jock. I'll just
sharing.
Yep, share my screen. Okay. Is that, are you seeing that slide there?
Yep.
Great. I'll just make sure that I can switch back to the dashboard. Thanks for the overview. It's always really good to remember what we're doing, why these ecosystems are so important, and why we need to do surveys in the first place. And the bit that I've been really passionate about in this project is taking that data and closing the loop, getting it back to people who have gone out and collected all this hard-fought data for us, and been able to present some reliable management options for what to do to protect these ecosystems. So that's where the dashboard comes in. So just a quick overview of how the data is used and then presented on the dashboard. And then I'll switch over to the dashboard and just do a quick run through of the different elements that are presented on the dashboard. And then I'll just come back to a couple of slides that will explain what some of those numbers mean, how we come up with them. Yeah, so starting with I imagine a few people have probably participated in the Salt Marsh Savers survey, but if not, there's an app that we use that collects that data. So the survey responses, we also collect site photos, which are really helpful, and a few free text answers for some qualitative data that we collect and present as well. And that gets uploaded to a server, the EpiCollect 5 server, where all of that is securely stored. We can't use that data directly on the dashboard. So we've come up with a piece of software that sits up in the cloud that runs our API that takes that data and it manipulates it and standardizes it so we can aggregate that into these different categories that Jock spoke about in different regions, apply the knowledge weighting to that data. So we've got really robust, usable data that then we can present on the dashboard. So without further ado, I'll bring up, you should be seeing the dashboard there now in the presentation, hopefully. So I'll just run through the major elements of the dashboard, and then I'll come back through and maybe with an example site and show the types of information that we collect, the threats and the values, and then how that's turned into management decision outcomes. So you can see here at the very top of the dashboard, we've got this filter section here. So at the moment we have data for 24 and 25. We're iteratively uploading data, and that goes back to 2020, I think, maybe not quite that far, but there are a few other years that we're slowly adding in that you'll see come up on the dashboard. So once a survey is completed and uploaded, automatically at 3 a.m. in the morning, the API goes out and fetches the new responses. It does what it needs to do to be able to present it. So it's a near real-time presentation of the data, so that the same day that the data is collected, the next day that data will be visible on the dashboard. The dashboard currently spans across 4 NRM regions, which you can see here. So the Burnett Mary, dry tropics, reef catchments, and the wet tropics. And a list of the sites are here. Currently, I'm looking at all of the years. So this year's slide is ignored. I'm looking at all the regions. So these are all 41 of the sites that we have collected data from. We can see that across all time, for as much as data we've uploaded to the site, there's been 524 surveys, which is great. And here we can see a value score. So this is the value score across all regions at the moment. So this all gets filtered down from this filter box here. So if I were to change this and just look at the wet tropics, then you can see it says fetching data. It does take a few seconds for it to reach out and get the new data and do its calculations. But we can see there were 10 sites across the wet tropics and 136 responses. So we can use these filter boxes to filter down to the regions or the sites or the years that we might be interested in. I'll just put this back to all sites so we can just see everything all at once. So when that updates there again, we'll see on here, these cluster dots are the different regions. If you click on those, we can see, so this is the wet tropics I'm looking at here. And these are the sites within the wet tropics. So you can zoom in on this map. You can switch between street view and satellite view. It's kind of standard sort of map functionality there, but you'll notice that if you click on a particular site, we get a little bit more information about the threat score of that site and the value score of that site. And really importantly, these two things here, which are the primary management outcome and the investment rank within the region. So what they mean, in essence, is the primary management, the different threats require different management approaches. So whether there's a direct threat or an indirect threat, or it might be a climate threat is the biggest threat in a site or a region, we'd obviously look at different management actions to manage those threats. And that's where the site is really useful, because you can just look at a site that you're interested in. You can see how much of a priority that site is within the region. So we can see across all time, if I look at the data for this particular site, it's the #1 ranked site for investment. So if I only had a small pool of money in this region, I would probably be spending it on this site, and conservation actions would be the types of things that I'd be looking to spend money on. So immediately, I think you can see like how powerful the tool is to be able to take that data and give us some really clear outcomes and metrics that are usable for all stakeholders for their different action plans that they might use. So going down further here, this is the overall threat and values of all of the sites. As you remember at the top, I've got all the sites in all regions selected at the moment. And this is a great overview of the threats versus the values at each site, because they're it's the interplay of the threats and the values at each site that we use to come up with our management outcomes in the system. So that's a really important consideration. You might only be interested in threats or only in values. So for each of the plots that you see on the dashboard, you can strike out anything in the legend that you don't want to see, and then focus in on the things that you might be interested in. So this makes it a little bit clearer to have a look at sites that might be particularly threatened, or conversely sites that are, and it's good to see that so many sites are so valued. They're all quite high there. So going down, then we get more and more detailed as we go down the dashboard. So the first section of the dashboard looks at the threats. And the threats are broken down into 3 categories, which are important for management considerations as well. So whether they're direct human impacts, indirect human impacts, or natural or climate sort of driven impacts. And that information is really useful in terms of what sort of actions we might be looking at in each particular site. And again, if I was only interested in the natural processes, I could strike out these other 2 and more clearly see those. Hovering over most things will give you a a bit of a context box here with some more information, so you can see the actual score. So if there's a site or a region that you're interested in, you can drill down and see more information. So as we go further down again, then we get more detailed, get one step more detailed. So we can look at the direct, indirect, and natural processes, threats, and see what indicators make up each of those things. So if it were indirect human impacts I was looking at or interested in, I could just focus on those and see that these ones here, the buffer zone condition and coastal squeeze, seem to be the biggest contributors of the overall score for the indirect human impacts. So it's really useful for being able to tailor to the particular types of data that you might be interested in or looking for. And when we go down here to this matrix, this is the knowledge weighted medians of each of the scores. So this is really kind of low level data now. This is the medians of all of the scores that you put in for each indicator within the EpiCollect app. So if there was a particular indicator that you might be interested in, you could come down here and have a look at the scoring for each individual. So depending on what level of data you require, what types of data you require, you can tailor the dashboard as you go to just show the things that you're interested in. So it's really good like that, because at first it seems like a lot of information on a page, particularly when I have all regions selected like this and all categories. That's a lot there. But know that you can filter at the top, and then you can filter all these different categories out, and then really just hone in on the things that are important to you at a particular time. So all that information is really visible and readily available. So after the threats, we move down to the values. So for instance, I was interested in cultural and recreation values of sites across all time, across all regions. I could have a look at this, and this first one here, Airport Boardwalk, jumps out as really significant in terms of cultural significance and recreational value, and it is quite an accessible site. So when we come down here, we drill down further again. So if I, as an example, wanted to focus on just those two things again, I can strike out all of these and then have a look at what is it about the recreational values that are important. So visual appeal seems to stand out to people, and also the accessibility of the site. So again, just more and more detail as you go down, and then individual scores again here. So you could look at a particular site, a particular metric, and have a look at how it stacks up against all other sites. So that's there's an incredible amount of data here, and hopefully it's not overwhelming. And being able to use those filters to just focus in on things, I think, is really handy, because it allows us to not get overwhelmed by the data. So what I'll do, I'll just quickly have a look at the wet tropics. I'll have a look at that Airport Boardwalk site that we saw, and we wait for it to fetch the data and update. So you'll notice a couple of other tiles have jumped up when I select a single site. I can then look at its investment ranking and its primary management option up here in the tiles. So this site is the 6th highest site for investment, and the types of things you would be investing in if you were looking at managing this site would be restoration or direct management actions. That filters out all the other sites. It just makes all of this a little bit cleaner now. So all of this data that we look at is just for the Airport Boardwalk. So, and again, just for the Airport Boardwalk, I wanted to look at just one element. I again can kind of filter out and drill down just on the things that are important to me. So as a manager, there's a huge amount of information that's available here on a state level, on a regional level, on a site-by-site level, across years, between regions, within regions. It's all available on the dashboard, and I invite everyone to jump in and have a play. You can't break anything, so please jump in and have a look at the dashboard, have a look at some sites that you know. A couple of other things I'll just point out quickly. When we do select just a single site, the site photos that we collect in the EpiCollect app uploaded and categorized. So you'll know if you've used or participated in a survey that particular indicator questions have an option to take a photo afterwards, and they're linked to that indicator. So for this site here, if I wanted to have a look at some of the threats, and apologies for scrolling up and down, but so mangrove encroachment here is quite high for one of our natural processes. So the photos come in handy because you can come down here and hopefully someone's taken a photo as an example, and there's one of mangrove encroachment that is just more validity and backs up the data that we're seeing with some more information. And the other thing that we ask people to do on the app is just some free text qualitative inputs, and you'll see that some of them can be a little bit loose because this is just open for people to put whatever they want. But what do you think the salt marsh is threatened by? So people can put in anything here that doesn't fit into that categorical 0 to 5 scoring system, and just provide managers with more information on people's perceptions of a site and a region. So this is sort of a useful thing as well. You can download this, it'll just download a CSV with that information if you wanted to use it in reports and different things. And the same with the photos. The photos are freely downloadable, and a zip folder will download with all of the photos in it as well. So for reporting and management decisions, that's just another useful thing that you can get from the site. So I hope that's a bit of a whirlwind run through of the site. I hope that's been okay and gives people a bit of an overview of the types of things that the dashboard provides, the type of information that's there, how that data gets from EpiCollect, gets transformed, and then presented as a management outcome on the dashboard, just to close that loop. So I'll just go back to the presentation. I'm not going to, we do have a technical paper that we're working on, so a methods paper that outlines exactly how we go from EpiCollect, from the raw data through the API and to the metrics that we see on the dashboard. But I'm just going to give a really, really quick overview, because I know not everyone's as much of a data nerd as I am, so try and keep it light. But one of the great things that the Saltmarsh Savers survey incorporates is the knowledge weighting system. So as Jock mentioned before, surveys that for people that are, know a site really intimately or have an incredible amount of saltmarsh knowledge get weighted slightly higher when we aggregate that data onto the dashboards, and that just gives us a more robust outcome. All the data still gets used, all of it gets averaged, but that knowledge weighting system is a really great way to just make sure that the data we present is really robust. And so the site level scores, as we mentioned, are just aggregated into different categories. So water quality, habitat recreation, carbon storage. That just takes an average of all of the individual indicators within a category. We treat them all equally. They all contribute towards the value of water quality or carbon storage for our purposes. So we take all of those indicators within the categories, we average them, and that gives us our scores for carbon storage and water quality, etc. The threat scores are a little bit more complex because we have direct threats, we have indirect threats, we have natural processes. All of these things kind of contribute slightly differently to how a site's overall threat score is calculated. Also, the number of threats, like I'm sure everyone's aware, that the more threats that there are, the more multi stresses that we have at a site, it's a cumulative threat process. So not just the severity of each individual threat, but how many threats are present. And you can see that back on the dashboard as well. That comes up if you hover over one of the dots. Yeah, so we can see a breadth score of 0.48, just to put it out there, is about half. So this site, Yorkeys Knob, for whatever year this was selected, had about half of the threats that we're surveying for present at the time, just under. So just another metric that we use. But just to understand that the threat index we see just isn't a simple average of scores. There's a whole lot that goes into it to provide that threat index. And the same with the management dashboard insights, and that's a more complex thing, and I won't even attempt to go into that too much now. That's something that we'll present when we release the methods paper. So feel free to read that if that's something that you're interested in. But just so you know, that sort of includes the direct intervention offsite. It includes the direct, natural, and indirect threats. They're assigned a high, medium, or low value, and then we use that in a decision matrix that looks at the interplay between how highly is this site threatened versus how highly is this site valued, and that's what drives our management outcomes, as well as what types of threats were they. So that's quite a complex piece. I'm just going to put that slide there and touch on it, but we'll go into more detail in that another time. And this is just a quick slide to say that when we do we can compare all sites across all regions and across all years. And what we do when we do that is we average each of the regions, each of the site surveys across all the years, because there are sometimes sites where we don't take surveys for a year, and sites where there are more surveys would skew the scoring. So all of that's taken into account when we if you were to select all sites, all regions, all years at the top. A lot sort of goes into that as well to make sure that the numbers that you're seeing are really robust kind of figures and metrics to be able to use in your management decisions. And that's about it in a nutshell. So what starts with the volunteer field observations on EpiCollect gets a knowledge weighting added to it, and then we build our weighted indicators of values and threats. We aggregate those into regions, into years, into different categories, and then we use all of that information to present our management priorities and the regional investment ranking, which are two of the really important things that the dashboard can provide. So I hope that hasn't been too much information and that some of that's sunk in. I'll stop sharing now and I'll pass back to Jock. And if anyone has any questions, please, feel free to either pop them in the chat or open your mic.